So we're here to have a look at hints and tips on applying for grants. And as you can imagine, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is from a perspective of Northamptonshire Community Foundation, but some of this can also be sort of general and you could apply to sort of any grants funder that you're looking at. Um, I'd also suggest as well that as well as looking at information on grant funders' websites, I'd really also suggest connecting in with your local infrastructure organisations. So in Northants, that will look like Aspire NN, which is a partnership that's made up of lots of different organisations. And they have some dedicated members of their team who look at supporting groups who are applying for applications, also things about governance, things around recruiting volunteers. So they have lots of information available. And then in the West, we have SORN, which is the Social Action West Northants Partnership, and that's made up of SMVB, so South Northants Volunteer Bureau, who have also taken over the Daventry Volunteer Centre, and then in Northampton, it's Voluntary Impact Northamptonshire, and again, they've got some key members of staff who can provide some information and advice about not only creating an organisation who can apply for grants, but also looking at grant funding and looking at draft applications as well. So a bit about, obviously these are the real basics, but thinking about before applying to to a grant funder and looking for grants, you have to make sure that you've got the right systems in place. So are you grant ready? So that can look at things like, have you got a constitution in place? So have you formed as a group? And also what kind of group have you formed as? So for organisations that are very small, so with an annual income of less than £5,000, you can set up as a voluntary constituted community group. So you can have a committee, but you are because of your limited income of less than 5k, you don't need to register with the Charity Commission or necessarily have a legal structure in place. What you would just need is have a written constitution and have at least 3 committee members who aren't related. But once your income gets to more than £5,000 quite regularly on an annual basis, that's when you have to look at whether or not you need to register as a charity or a CIO, so a charitable incorporated organisation, or a CIC, so a community interest company, or some other type of legal structure. And that's when you'll most likely either have to register with the Charity Commission or you'll have to register with Companies House. You'll have to make sure that hopefully you've got the right people on your committee or on your trustee board or your directors who have got the right skills to support your organisation. So hopefully you've got people in there who are able to support you with things like sort of marketing, admin, those who might maybe have some skills around accounting and finance. Those are the sort of things that you might want to have a think about. You have to make sure that you've also got the right policies in place. So this means that you have got things like safeguarding policies in place, equality and diversity policies in place, that you might also have policies if you've got if you're having paid members of staff, any specific policies, if you've got things around loan working, volunteers, etc. There is lots of information out there. And again, this is where I'd also suggest having a chat with your local infrastructure organisations. So Voluntary Impact Northamptonshire, Serve, Groundwork, Daventry, etc. Because they'll have a lot of resources to help you with those things like governance and policies. But there's also lots of information online, such as the National Council for Voluntary Organisations, and there's lots of templates out there that you can use and adapt. We also asks that organisations have at least 2 signatories on their bank account, and the bank account needs to be in the organisation's name, and it needs to be set up as a community or a business bank account, depending on how you're set up. This is because you've got to have those financial procedures in place to ensure that there isn't that you're going to be limiting the possibility of any type of fraud, and this is a really important aspect for any type of organisation, and it's one of the safeguarding rails that you can have in place. So when you're having a look at obviously you've established your organisation, you're thinking about what are your main aims of your organisation and what your objectives are. You have to think about what is the issues that you're wanting to tackle, and that's when you can start thinking about what projects you want to plan and how you might be able to use grant funding to support that. So this is where we ask you to have a think about the T-GROW exercise, which stands for obviously topic. So what are the issues that you're looking to tackle? What is the need? So it could be, for example, that you are looking to support people who are experiencing financial difficulties. And then you're thinking about so you've identified that that could be an issue. Other ones obviously could be things around social isolation, or it could be around giving people more access to the arts. So thinking about what that issue could be. Then the aims, so the goal, that's what you're trying to achieve. So what are the outcomes that you're looking to do? So a lot of the time it's fairly easy to do because it's normally the opposite of what your issue is. So once you've identified an issue, your aim should hopefully be to tackle that issue. So if you know that there's a lot of isolation in your community, your goal, your aim would be to reduce isolation. So other ones could be other outcomes that you might be thinking of is sort of increase volunteering, reduce food poverty. Try and think of it as sort of obviously the opposite of what your issue is, and that's what your goal and your aims are going to be to do the opposite of that. Then once you have sort of really identified those, then you're looking at reality. So that is, where are you now? So what resources does your community organisation already have, and what do you need? So and also it's part of thinking about, is your organisation the right one to deliver this, deliver the project, or should you be looking to partner with another? So where are you now? That could include looking at things like, have you got the skills in your team? So for example, if you're looking to work with children, young people, do the people in your team have either some kind of youth work experience? Have they got the right safeguarding training in place? Or it could be around practical things like, do you have a space where your project is going to take place? If you do you have the right equipment? So, and then thinking about what you perhaps don't have. So whether you are looking to purchase equipment, or you need to look at venue hire. Then options. So what are the possibilities? So for your organisation, you figured out what you do have, you figured out what you don't have, and then the possibilities are there opportunities to work with other organisations who might be able to support you with that? So for example, could you work with the local community centre? Could you, in terms of accessing a space, is there an organisation who might potentially loan equipment to you? And then also you'd be looking at the possibilities and the options of funding. So then you'll start thinking about, what funding do I need? How much do I need? Where could I possibly look to get this funding from? And then thinking about what is essential for delivering the project, and then what are the nice to haves. So what are the bare bones that we need, and what are possibly just add-ons that might make things a bit better. And then the last one is will. So this is commitment. So how committed are you to the project? And the reason we put this in is because sometimes in terms of accessing funding, or in terms of working with NCF, we try to make the process fairly quick and streamlined where we can. But so for some other funders, um, they might only have grants panels that maybe sit once a year or once every 6 months, or sometimes it can take though 3 to 6 months to find out whether or not your funding has been awarded, and that often depends on the funder and also the size of the grant that you're looking to apply for. So that will and commitment is sort of a big one to keep to enable to keep you going. So this is what we've got on the slide now is something that's called a theory of change. And this goes back to thinking about the issues and the outcomes that you're looking to achieve. And this is a really useful one and an important one when you're thinking about how to talk about your project to a funder. And then also thinking about being able to look back and evaluate what your project is trying to do and being able to capture evidence around it. So a theory of change can be a really complicated document. There are some ones out there that make it quite intense, but this one is just a very simple, light touch way of looking at it. And as you can see on one side, we've got issues. So again, as I was saying earlier, thinking about what the issues that your community is facing and that you think need support. So that could be things around poor mental health, poor physical health and well-being. It could be about unemployment or poverty. Any of those sorts of things that you can either see anecdotally or you might have data on. And in terms of data, just to sort of bring that up, on our website, we do have a section called Our Work, and within that, there is some information about our hidden needs report, which gives you some data and some stats and facts about the needs within Northamptonshire. And then we also have our local insights report, which again gives a sort of overview of the sort of data across the county, again where there might be highlight areas of deprivation, issues around crime and community safety, issues around housing, for example. So there's we do provide some resources for you to be able to have a look at different data sets. So once you've looked at those issues, you're then obviously trying to look at what is the impact. So what are you trying to solve? And again, it's those thinking about those reversals. So you're looking to improve physical well-being, or you're looking to improve people's mental health. You're looking to reduce poverty. You're looking to increase employment. So it's thinking about using words like improve or reduce or increase. Those are the sort of types of words that you're looking to use in terms of what you're wanting to achieve this project to achieve. And so in the centre, our service is what you're hoping is going to get those individuals from point A, where they're experiencing all these issues, to point B, where they're having a lot of improvement in their lives. And so the project, the service that you're looking to deliver, should some way show how you're going to get people from one point to another. So thinking about if you're looking to reduce isolation, how are you going to get people to do that? So are you going to have events? Are you going to look at befriending? All of those sorts of things. And there should be a sort of a fairly clear through line of the issue, then the service, and then how that's going to improve people's lives and tackle the issue. So you've got an idea of what you want your project to be. You've looked at the issues, you've maybe found some data to back up that. You maybe have got some anecdotal information from your community as well as some data. You've thought about your service and you've thought about how it's going to then improve their lives. So once you have those really clearly set out, you might want to do some things, as I said, to help back that up. So this can include things like, as I said, looking at our hidden needs report, looking at the local insights reports that we have on our website. It could be looking at national statistics. It could also be you doing a survey with your own beneficiaries. So, for example, you could be do a survey out to your current cohort of community and asking them perhaps what their needs are. Whether you can make it targeted to talk about, for example, if you know that anecdotally you see a lot of issues around mental health, you can make it specific to that, or you could do a fairly broad one so that people can feedback to you about lots of different things. I've talked obviously about the local research that you can do. We talk about sort of hard and soft data, and so the hard data would be the sort of stats and facts and data, and then the soft data would be more around things like feedback, testimonials, case studies, people with lived experience. You might be looking for grant funding to continue a project, in which case it's really important to be able to look at the sort of the so I've lost my train of thought there. But, so, for example, if you're looking for continuation, you might be able to get those, as I said, testimonials for people that have gone through your service, your project, and have been supported. And you might have a quote that you can use from them that really sort of drives that home about why that funding is needed to continue the project. So then looking on to the next stage, it's really about then looking at reading the guidance. So checking that your organisation is eligible to apply. So you've maybe done a funder search, and we've got actually a learn and share that we did recently about alternative sources of funding. So not only do we talk about, so you can see on our website the funding that we have, but we also do a learn and share session about alternative sources of funding. As I've said, also the local infrastructure organisations can help you with that as well. I know that Aspire NN do monthly sessions where you can go to a grants search, drop in, and they can help you look for appropriate grants. But when you're doing your own research, it's really good to have a look at making sure that you're eligible to apply. So that can include making sure that your organisation fits with the funder. So there are some organisations, for example, who will only fund registered charities. Then you have other funders who are open to funding CICs, or they're open to funding companies limited by guarantee. Then you'll have some obviously who might be very geographically specific, so that they are only there to support organisations in a particular area. And then some of them are very much focused on theme. So for example, they might be only funding projects connected to health and well-being, or for example, like the Arts Council, they're there to fund arts and arts projects mainly, and then they have their heritage funding as well. So making sure that your project and your organisation is eligible to apply. It's also good to make sure that you can have an opportunity to speak to the grants officer if you can. So getting in touch with the grants team, if you can via email or on the phone, to maybe talk through your project. They might be able to give you a steer as to whether or not the project that you're looking to apply to meets their criteria or not. They might be able to give you a steer. Another example is also being able to look at what the funder has previously funded. So some funders will publicise what they've funded on their websites, so you can have a look at what they've funded before. Or some funders also publish what they've funded on something called 360 Giving, which is a big database where you can have a look at, for example, you could put in, search the, Northamptonshire as an area, and you could see all the different, well, those who do publish on there, but you can see, for example, what the National Lottery have funded in the area. You could see what Northamptonshire Community Foundation is funded in the area. Lots of different funders publish on there. So you could have a look to see what they've previously funded before. And often it goes back years and years and years. So that's lots of information on there. You could also talk to other organisations as well. So if you know that there's another organisation who are tackling mental health, perhaps in a different area of the county, or perhaps with a different focus, they might be able to let you know where they've been funded before. But the most important thing is not to shoehorn your organisation or your project into a criteria that it doesn't fit into, because not only will you be wasting your time, because we know that obviously it takes a really long time to put together an application, but also you'll be wasting the funders' time as well. But obviously, the most important thing is we don't want you to waste your time. So make sure that your organisation and your project fits. So planning your application, so make the most of it. So what I mean by that is making sure that obviously you normally have a fixed word count. So making your application as streamlined as possible, in the sense that use the questions to your advantage. So for example, describing your project, a lot of the time the organisation, the funder, will just be wanting to know what the main information is about your project, i.e. the who, what, where, why, when of it all. There'll be hopefully other questions within the application where you can talk about things like the impact or the need, but it's really important to make sure that you've got in there the who it's for, when is it happening, where is it happening, who's delivering it, how is it being delivered. Those are some important questions. And then hopefully there'll be other points where you can say the why. So for example, what's the need and what are people going to get out of it? So make sure that whoever's the main contact on your project has been well briefed, so that ideally, the person writing the application will be the main contact, but sometimes we know that that isn't always the case. Always make sure that you plan your application as a draft first. So that could be where you can write your application on the form and then save it as you go along. But we also really recommend that you make sure that you have a Word copy of it, because sometimes glitches happen with online grant systems. They might time out, or there might be an issue with the form. So having a copy of it as a Word document is a really good backup. Don't assume that the funding organisation will know your group or its track record. So try and make sure that your application is clear, because even if you've been funded by an organisation before, they might be working with a new assessor who isn't necessarily aware of your work. The application might be reviewed by a panel member who might be new to the organisation or hasn't heard of your organisation before. So being really clear and not assuming that people know who you are or know your work is really good to be on top of. Make sure that you give yourself plenty of time to plan and prepare. As funders, we always see applications coming in sort of fairly slowly once a funding program has been opened, and then we always see this really big flurry at the end of on the day of the deadline, where lots of applications come in last minute. And sometimes that absolutely works fine for a group. However, if you've left it to the last minute and then suddenly something goes wrong, your laptop breaks, your printer breaks, there's a glitch on the system, and you've left it all to the last minute, that sometimes can mean that you haven't necessarily got time to fix things and get things corrected in time to meet the deadline. So try as much as possible to get it in maybe a day before or 2 days before the deadline, at least, to give yourself that breathing space. Making sure that you really describe the project. So again, that's going back to, if you're when they're asking you to describe the project, make sure that you're really saying, for example, you might be, let's say, putting on a youth group because you want to tackle those things about isolation and increase confidence. Those are all really good things to say in the sections with the right questions. Often with that first question, where it says to describe the project, what they're wanting to hear is, for example, how often or how many sessions you're going to be delivering of this youth project, of this youth group. So are they meeting once a week, twice a week, once a month? What day are they meeting on? How long is it going to be? Who's going to be staffing it? Those sorts of questions, because later on, depending on the application, you'll hopefully have questions later on where you can do all those things about the need and the impact that it's going to have. But please make sure that you are describing the project as well, so that you can create a really clear picture in the grant assessor's mind and the grants panel's mind, so that they know they can really visualize what's going on. The other things to think about is making sure that you are sending in all of the supporting documents that are needed. So hopefully the grant funder will make it very clear on their website about what documents are needed. So whether they need to see copies of your constitution, your governing documents, they might want to see copies of policies, they might want to see references, they might want to see a bank statement, your annual accounts, any of those sorts of things to do their due diligence checks. Make sure that you have copies of those. Some funders want them signed, others they don't mind so much. But making sure that you, again, this is part of that planning process, so that when you know that you're going to apply to a funder, make sure you know well in advance what they need, because if you need a reference but you only realise the day before, it's going to be harder for you to get a reference. Whereas if you have looked at that you're going to apply to a funder, you know that the deadline is in a few weeks' time, start getting those documents together already, so that it's not a last minute scramble. Hello, skipped on quite a bit. So here's some examples of grant application questions. These are based on questions that we have, that NCF has within its application form. Often funders will have similar sorts of questions in their application forms. It won't be worded the same way, but sometimes they'll be essentially the same sorts of questions. So how will you spend this grant? Describe the work that you're asking to fund, or describe the project that you are wanting funding for. So this is that first question where we really want to know, what activities are you going to provide? How often are they going to take place? You might want to mention how you're going to get your local community involved. So for example, you might want to mention if, let's say, using that example of a youth group, whether your organisation is perhaps connected to any schools. If you have already been running your youth group and you've already got, let's say, 30 regular attendees coming each week, or if it's a new project, you're going to connect with some other local organisations to get young people to attend. And then also you might be able to say, what sort of activities are you going to do at your youth group? But as I said, you can apply this to any sort of project that you're looking for. Also keep an eye on the word count or the word limit on questions as well. Then there'll often be a question about need or disadvantage that your project is going to tackle. So this is where you might talk about any evidence that you've gathered, whether that's that hard data and stats and statistics. So you might be able to say, well, in this area, we know that there's X number of young people who don't obtain GCSE results, or you might be able to say, we know that levels of antisocial behaviour are high in this area, or whatever it might be that's backing up your need to have this project in place or the project to be continued to be funded. You might have, as I said, done some surveys. You might have got some feedback from young people who have attended, still sticking with that example. You might have spoken to local schools in the area. You might have spoken to perhaps your local police officers who cover the area. You might have gathered lots of different information from different places to be able to say what the need and disadvantage is that you're tackling with your project or community, and then hopefully you'll be able to go on to this next question, which is about impact and difference that your project is going to make. So as I've said kind of throughout, then you'll be able to talk about the positive impacts of the project and what outcomes you're looking to achieve. So whether you're looking to increase access to services, reduce isolation amongst older people, and how your project is going to be able to do that. So whether it's about building connections or whether it's about encouraging physical and mental health awareness, providing activities that are going to get people moving, whatever it might be, but how your project is then going to make those positive impact and outcomes take place. And then this question, sometimes funders will ask it, sometimes they won't. We certainly ask it at NCF, but we ask about how you're going to measure and report back on those positive changes. So if you are saying that you're hoping that your project is going to, for example, support younger people, how are you going to be able to evidence that? So it could be things like looking at attendance, so whether tracking attendance to ensure that people come back week on week, or that the numbers are increasing. It could be things like, again, doing a survey or a questionnaire. It could be, for example, looking at providing a case study so that we can see about sort of a story of change where somebody maybe has started the youth club, and then how they've been able to have their lives improved by taking part. So some of that will be what we call quantitative data. So that'll be the numbers. So the number of people attending, the number of volunteers, the number of people who say that they've, let's say, improved their confidence. And then there's going to be qualitative data. And the qualitative data are things like where people have given you feedback or quotes, or, for example, if you've done an interview or a chat with a service user and they've given you some information about how it's improved their lives, that's the qualitative data. And also things like photos are qualitative data, films and videos of your project taking place, that's also qualitative data. So there's lots of different ways to be able to show the impact that your project has had. We also do a session on, that's actually the next session that we're doing in July is going to be on end of grant reports and impact and outcomes. So if you're looking for more information about that, we'll be covering that in our next session in July. But then moving on to the budget. So it's best to not to guess about the figures and not never assume that an inflated budget is going to get you more funding or sort of more of it will be covered. Trying to keep it as realistic as possible, because one of the things that often funders will look at is whether or not a project is value for money. So, for example, if you're looking at working with a relatively small number of people, they're going to be wanting to see what that cost per beneficiary is. So keep it realistic. And yeah, there will be some projects where the cost per beneficiary might be quite high because, for example, they're maybe having something that's quite one-to-one and quite intensive, such as counselling. But where possible, try and obviously keep budgets realistic and cost effective. Provide the information as provide as much information as possible, and also then provide a detailed breakdown of the figures. So rather than just saying operational costs £1,000, what operational costs will be covered? So, for example, is it going to be things like staff costs? And then if so, what's the pay per hour? What are the roles that will be funded? If it's going to be activity costs, describe what those activity costs are and what again. So, for example, if you are going to be inviting in guest speakers, how much is that going to cost? If you're going to be purchasing equipment, often putting links to the items or quotes is really important, particularly if you're doing any, as I said, capital work or purchasing equipment. If you're doing marketing, again, make sure that you say, for example, if you're doing flyers or if you're doing online advertising campaign, make sure that you break it down. So how much is it going to cost per advertisement, or how many flyers are you going to purchase and what cost? So really break it down. We provide headings in our applications, but some funders don't, and they'll just have a big budget section that you can fill out yourself. So, but I would suggest breaking it down to make it really clear. Also, try and make it clear about the money that you're applying for, whether or not that's going to be covering all of the costs of the project, or if you have any contributions that your organisation is covering. So, for example, if your organisation is going to be covering the office overheads or any sort of staff time is going to be covered by the organisation and you're not asking for that to be funded, just to show what your organisation is contributing to the project. Obviously, it's a fine line of not underestimating costings, but also not creating an unrealistic wish list. So as I said, trying to make it as accurate as possible. Making sure that you've got financial systems in place. That more sort of goes back to what we were talking about earlier about financial processes and procedures, like having 2 signatories on a bank account to make sure that you're reducing that likelihood of fraud. And then a big one is make sure that it adds up correctly. Make sure that the maths work out, because there are many a time where we review a budget and it doesn't make sense. So if double checking it, getting another member of the team to double check it is a really good idea. If you do have a finance person within your organisation, getting them to double check it is a good idea, because lots of times we have a look at budgets and sometimes things don't add up clearly. So this is sort of an example of a budget breakdown. As I said, we have this breakdown within our applications online. However, some don't, and this would be good for when you're planning. So having the capital cost, so what you're looking to purchase, making sure that you've got quotes or links in place, what the total cost is and what the requested amount is. And if you're asking for less than the total cost, putting in a note in the description or breakdown to say whether or not your organisation is covering it, or if you have other funding from another funder that's going to cover it, is really useful to know. The same goes obviously with staff costs, so looking at who the member's role is, what's the cost per hour or the salary, How many hours are they dedicating to the project? Because you might already have an existing member of staff and they have other roles and responsibilities. So how much time are they dedicating to the project or the service? Volunteer costs. So volunteers can only the only costs that can be covered are things like reimbursing things that they've purchased for the project. So, for example, if they've purchased a notebook or if they have paid for travel costs or parking costs or refreshments, you can reimburse those costs. But you can't say, oh, we're going to give our volunteers £50 per day, because that's essentially paying them a wage or paying them, um, in terms of HMRC, it looks as though you're paying them, whereas really you should be getting things like either you're paying for things already. So, for example, you might be buying in a bulk load of tea, coffee, refreshments, biscuits, those sorts of things, or providing lunch for them, or the volunteer is putting those costs already. So they are, as I said, doing things like travel costs. So you're then going to be paying them back mileage or parking costs or bus fees, those sorts of things. But you can't just say we're going to give each volunteer £10, for example. Um, Operational costs. So this will be obviously your activity costs, and it's very much dependent on what activity you're providing. Overhead costs, so things like utility costs, venue hire, those sorts of things. Publicity costs. We also have an other section. So if you are sort of finding it hard to fit in to the right budget heading, we do have an other section where you can note down anything else that you're not quite sure where it's going to be covered. And as well as obviously putting in the total costs and the requested amount, let us know how much you've raised so far, or how much your organisation is going to provide in kind. And if there is a shortfall, so for example, you're applying to us for £5,000, but your project is £10,000, and you've already raised, let's say, £2,000, there's going to be a shortfall of £3,000. So how is that going to be covered? Are you applying to other funders? Are you going to be doing a fundraising activity that's going to fill in? Are you going to be asking for donations from your service users? What are you doing to cover that shortfall? So getting towards the end now. So making sure that your application is easy to understand. So making sure that you don't use any abbreviations or acronyms, or for example, your organization might be very involved in, let's say, mental health support. So you might be using terminology that perhaps members of the NHS might use, but make sure that it's really clear for someone to understand who isn't necessarily an expert in that area. So as I said, avoiding those abbreviations and acronyms that you might be able to use quite easily in your working life, but won't necessarily be clear for somebody who is working as a in terms of a grant funder. Things to also think about is that funders won't fund any retrospective funding. You can apply to other funders for the same project, but if you receive funding from elsewhere for the same project, you need to withdraw any applications that you have in progress and make them aware that you've already received the funding that you need. If you're successful, making sure that you read the grant agreement and the contract that you might be sent. So there'll be some terms and conditions that are likely attached to the grant funding. A lot of that will be obviously things around deadlines for reporting back to the funder, about possibly publicly acknowledging the grant, either through your website or social media, publicity, for example. Also, if your application is rejected, ask for feedback and think about how you can improve your application for the next time. Some funders sadly don't provide feedback, but if they do, um, you know, then I would suggest taking up the opportunity to get feedback. I mean, sometimes it will be down to sadly there just not being enough funding available, but they might be able to give you some useful information for you to take forward through to your next application. And as I mentioned earlier, proofreading, getting another member of your team to read through it can be really helpful. At NCF, we do offer to read grant applications in advance. We normally ask that if the funding program has a deadline, that you get in contact with us at least a week before the deadline so that we've got time to read through it and provide feedback. And obviously that's specific to grant funding that NCF manages. But your local infrastructures, some of those organisations might be able to also offer draft application feedback to support you as well. And I think the final thing to think about when you're looking at applying for grants is that thing around measuring impact. So hopefully within your application, you've already created a plan about how you're going to capture the information about how your project is making a real difference in your community. And you'll be thinking about how to set things up. So making sure that you've got key deadlines about when you're going to gather information, how you're going to gather it, whether that be, there's lots of different ways. So some have got quite sophisticated things like outcome and impact stars. Others have a more sort of basic bare bone way of doing it, but making sure that you've got some kind of system in place to be able to look at evaluating the project. And as I've mentioned in our July Learn and Share, we'll be covering that in a bit more detail so that you can sort of plan things in advance to show the difference that your community organisation is making. So just to sort of sum up, have the right people in place, have a clear idea about what you want to do some research, check that you fit the criteria, making sure that you have got the information and documents and things that you need in place. And obviously making sure that you really plan out the project clearly and plan out your application clearly. So we're going to come to an end there. And I'm going to stop the recording.